I paid my $20. I did the CrossFit Open. Afterwards, I was cut from the rest of the season. But I think I can afford to take that financial hit. It's easy to say that cuts at the CrossFit Games can make the viewing experience more enjoyable for fans. We can even follow the logic behind the argument. But when we consider that the majority of people watching the CrossFit Games will be doing so from home over YouTube for free, it's understandable that the financial element probably isn't first and foremost in people's minds. And even those that argue against the concept of cuts, the focus tends to be on the test as a whole, the programming before cuts are made, whether or not athletes can take every part of the test, do all the workouts, how that could have an effect on the leaderboard. Even on the final day, someone that is not going to make it onto the podium can affect the podium. And if someone does decide to start talking about the finances for athletes, generally it's in regards to missed opportunities. The fact that sponsors want athletes on the field for all 4 days, or opportunities that are missed because an athlete doesn't get to hit a home run on the Sunday when there's a real wheelhouse workout that would have got their name into more homes around the world because they'd been cut previously in the competition. Now, of course, these situations are hypothetical in nature. But what's not hypothetical is the amount of money that athletes are having to spend to make it to the CrossFit Games. And as CrossFit becomes more global and guarantees spots to people from different parts of the world, we can see that those costs can vary greatly depending on the region a person is coming from. But just how much money are we talking about? How much does it cost an athlete to go to the CrossFit Games? And why not? Let's add semi-finals in there as well, just to see how much they are spending throughout their games season. And why not, at this point, have a guess in the comments. Let me know, how much do you think it's costing these athletes to get to the CrossFit Games? Well, I won't be joining you in the comments guessing, because actually I've reached out to a few different athletes that have gone through different semi-finals from different parts of the world to have an idea of how much it's costing them to get to the CrossFit Games. And once we see how much money athletes are actually having to invest to travel and go to the CrossFit Games, maybe then we'll understand why not everyone is super happy about the concept of cuts and potentially only getting 2 days of competition. Particularly if you're traveling from outside of North America. In fact, we will leave North America to last. But first, just think about the registration fees alone. $20 for the Open, $50 for the quarterfinals, $300 for semis, and $300 for the games. So across the board, it doesn't matter where you live, you're already going to be paying out about $670 just in registration fees before you've even left the home. But of course, only the first 2 parts of that are online competition. Afterwards, you are going to have to travel. And let's start by looking at Elisa Fuliano. She's representing Italy and she had to go through the semi-final in Berlin. So she told me that her expenses for Berlin were about €2,500, which is about $2,800. So that was for Berlin, but how much is the games going to cost her? Well, she told me it's going to cost between €7,000 and €8,000. So let's be kind, we'll just take the middle, let's say €7,500. Once again, if we turn that into dollars, we're looking at about $8,400. So for Elisa, we've got $8,400 for the games. Add to that the $2,800 for semi-finals, and we're looking at about $11,200 in total. And let's add on to that the $670 of registration fees. So at this point, we are creeping up to almost $12,000 all in. Now that sounds like a lot to me, but Seher Kaya will be thinking what a bargain Elisa got for semi-finals. If we didn't know, Seher is representing Turkey at the CrossFit Games and therefore had to travel to Korea for her semi-finals, costing her $6,000, so almost double what Elisa had to pay going to Berlin. She's then got very similar costs for travel and accommodation to the CrossFit Games at around $8,000, so maybe just a little bit less than Elisa's paying. But all in all for Seher, we're looking at about $14,000, and then add again on top of that the registration fees. Now I wish I could tell you that that was the most expensive example I found, but unfortunately it wasn't. Of course, some people, they need to travel to the games even earlier. They need time to acclimatize themselves, especially if it's going to be a big change for their time zone. And that means that some people traveling from places like Australia are going to do so a month or more in advance, giving them enough time to be ready to compete at the games. So for someone like Jay Crouch, semi-finals were a bargain, just 3,000 Australian dollars. It comes to about 2,050 US. But he's then told me that his trip to the games is going to cost him anywhere between 12 to 15,000 US dollars. So if we're kind and we take it from somewhere in the middle, maybe around the 13,500 mark, add on that the $2,000 for semi-finals, stick on top of that the registration fees, and we're creeping up around the $16,000 mark. Of course, then if it's closer to that top end of 15,000, it could be even more than that. So with these examples, we can see that clearly they're having to spend a lot of money just on travel and accommodation alone for the semi-finals and the games. But it's not always so extreme, is it? Particularly when we look at athletes already living in North America. For example, I asked Colton Mertens about his expenses. Now, for semi-finals, accommodation and lodging, it was about $2,500. It's going to be just under $3,000 for the games. So all in, he's less than $6,000 for semi-finals and the games, which is less than Sahir had to pay just to go to the semi-finals. And while that's still a decent amount of cash, it's a lot less than others are having to pay out. And yes, at this point, we could point out that no one is forcing athletes to make these decisions. No one's got a gun to their heads. Cuts have been a thing in the past, so they should have gone in knowing that their potential was there to be cut and not to experience all the days of competition. And yes, the games will bring with it some financial opportunities that they may not have had they not been able to put games athlete in their bio. But at the same time, if the people that are making decisions regarding cuts are those that tend to be in the US, that are maybe surrounded by athletes that are also living, competing, training in North America, it's understandable that maybe they're not taking into consideration the financial burden that is being put upon these athletes. And we have to also think that athletes, particularly those that are maybe going to make it for their rookie year to the games, or those that are just making it in, that are potentially the most likely to be cut, are probably not full-time athletes. So another expense to think about is how much money are they maybe losing by having to take that time away from working because they want to go and compete at the games. But the biggest question we want to ask is, how does this affect the sport as a whole? Remember, Dave Castro said it isn't the popular decision, but he believes it is the right decision to push forward the sport of CrossFit. So how does this affect the big picture? Well, one example we could look to is how often we hear people asking, well, why are these athletes doing smaller competitions in the lead up to the games? Shouldn't they be focusing solely on going to the games and doing their best at that competition? And couldn't this be the answer? Maybe games athletes need to go to these smaller competitions where they've got a bigger chance of walking away with the prize purse to help fund the money that they need to then travel to the games. So then the follow-on question is, well, at what point do we reach a tipping point? When does an athlete decide it's more financially advisable for them to just go around picking up prize money from smaller competitions than the amount of money they have to pay out to travel to the games to compete and potentially get cut? Or even just pivoting their fitness and using it in other avenues that they feel will be more lucrative. And of course, without the cuts, it's just an extra 2 days of competition. So is that really going to change things? Who knows? But if you paid out a lot of money at a fancy restaurant and were only allowed to eat half the meal, I can understand why you'd be frustrated.